I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Well, looky there.
Now I can hear you.
Yes. So it looks like right now it is me and you. Ryan was here. There he is. Okay. I shouldn't be muted now. Like I said at the beginning, it's a Monday. My camera freaked out. My mic was on mute. Whoa, where are you going down there?
I'm just scooting down a little bit.
All right. Okay, so people are starting to trickle in. Two people, a couple of tricklers. We need more. We need more tricklers.
We do need more tricklers. Tricklers are good.
So my camera just died out again.
Yep, you're frozen.
Yep, I am. Can you still hear me though?
Yes.
Okay, let's see. Oh man. So it is doesn't seem to be playing on YouTube. So it is doesn't seem to be playing on YouTube. There. All right. So I don't know what's up with this camera. I've got a new camera. I'm trying to improve myself. So let's do this.
If you're still talking, I can't hear you.
So I thought I could take me out, but apparently I lose my audio when I do that, and that way you could just talk without looking at my beautiful face. At least, at least I'm not locked open with my mouth open or yawning or something like that. So I
No.
don't know why, but this iPhone does not want to stay running, and I've tested it before, and it's done all right until, of course, when you put it into action. So
Nope, you're
there's
moving now.
that. I'm wondering what can I move from stream solo layout. Oh, that's not what we want. Back to that. Oh. Hmm. All right, so Joe's here. So there's three people. All right, so this is what happens when I bear with me. I put it up on the stand. I clip it in. I sit down. Things are great. Maybe great. It says there are 8 people watching. Well, I'm happy somebody can read that. I just don't know. Anyway, I'm going to try to be quiet. Does everybody want to hear what Jennifer has to say uh, about the USS Indianapolis CA-35? Did I get it?
You got it. Yes.
Woo! All right. I'm going to try
And
to figure
it's
out how to get me out of the way, but you go ahead and talk.
okay. It's important to throw in the CA-35 because there are actually 4 ships named Indianapolis. And so the one we're going to talk about, CA-35, that's the whole number, was the second ship. So she was commissioned in 1932, heavy cruiser, which she had a very stellar short life. She was commissioned in 32, sank in 45, so she only lasted for 13 years. But in that 13 years, she was Franklin Roosevelt's ship of state. She was Admiral Spruance's flagship of the Fifth Fleet, which meant Spruance was on the decks of Indy a lot. And my friend James, who was a survivor, I asked him once if he ever saw Admiral Spruance on the ship, and he said yes. And when I did, I went the other direction. He didn't want to cross paths with him. And she also earned 10 battle stars, which meant she participated in 10 major battles during World War II. The story that we'll discuss tonight starts with March 31st, 1945. She was bombarding Okinawa in anticipation of the Allied invasion the next day when she was hit by a kamikaze. The plane basically deflected off the ship and landed in the ocean, but the bomb was released before that and went through the hull, through the ship, all the way down into the ocean. And when around the time it hit the water, it exploded. Caused pretty significant damage to the ship, but more importantly, took the lives of 9 crew, injured several others. They were able to get back to Mare Island for repairs. And the reason that was important is because the Manhattan Project scientists were also wrapping up their project. So being a cruiser, she was a fast ship, which was one reason that Spruance liked her so much. And she was stateside when the Manhattan Project was finished. So it made her a prime.
What was the Manhattan Project?
That was the creation of the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
So because she was already stateside and because she was fast, Captain McVeigh was told, we have a special mission for you. And it's top secret, but the every minute that you save in transporting this cargo to Tinian is one less minute that the war will happen. So he didn't know what he was carrying. He just knew that he had to get there fast. So they loaded a large crate and 2 cylinders that actually were carried with the luggage of 2 Army officers who were disguised as artillery officers, but they were actually there to monitor the cargo. And actually also one of them was a medical officer who was there to monitor the radiation of the uranium that was in those cylinders. So
you say uranium?
Yes.
In the cylinder, were those cylinders the ones that were in the luggage?
Well, they weren't in like suitcases, but they were brought in with the officers'
so
luggage.
So it wasn't carry-on baggage, and you put in the overhead compartment.
They were carried on the ship. They weren't loaded by the crane because they weren't as heavy. So again, nobody knew what they were carrying, but they canceled all leaves. Nobody was allowed to leave the ship. The repairs were not even actually completed at that point, but they had to get underway. So July 16th, they left Mare Island, California for Pearl Harbor. And actually some of the men who were working on the ship worked on it all the way through till they got to Pearl Harbor, and then they disembarked there. Indy still holds the record for that trip. 74 and a half hours is still the record 77 years later to get from California to that point in Pearl Harbor. So they left Pearl Harbor and went on to Tinian. They arrived there July 26th.
Where's Tinian?
It's in the Marianas Islands. Does that tell you?
Boy, yeah. The Mariana Islands, that's the place to be.
Google it. So they unloaded the cargo. Indy went on her way to Guam, and the bomb parts, which they did not know what they had delivered. They still didn't know what they delivered, but turned out to be the bomb parts to make Little Boy, the bomb that was loaded onto the Enola Gay. And if I remember correctly, it was actually assembled on the plane while they were traveling. And Paul Tibbets and his crew dropped it on Hiroshima a few days later. So the other bomb was actually taken by plane. They wanted them taken in separate modes of travel in case something were to happen. They didn't want to lose both. And anyway, obviously it was a successful drop. So they left Tinian. They went on to Guam. They left Guam on their way to Leyte, which was an island in the Philippines. And the captain asked for an escort, and that he was told that they didn't need one, that it had been relatively quiet. Their route was fairly peaceful. They shouldn't anticipate any dangers. The problem was, as a heavy cruiser, they had no radar equipment. So if there were submarines lurking underwater, they wouldn't know. And that's exactly what happened. So the night of July 29th, relatively calm night, and the captain's orders were, if it is a clear night with good visibility, you need to zigzag. And zigzagging is when you basically go left, right, like a Z, in order to make yourself a harder target to hit. So it was cloudy that night, and so he did not zigzag, and it was at his discretion if he chose to zigzag. So he went to his cabin to turn in for the night, and little did they know that lurking in the waters was the I-58 Japanese submarine. There was a brief break in the clouds. The moon came out, and that illuminated the ship. Commander Hashimoto saw all he needed to see, and he ordered 6 torpedoes fired at the ship. He also had, I think, 2 chitons on standby. And chitons are manned torpedoes, which I cannot even imagine, because if you miss your target and you're in one of those, you sink to the bottom and wait to die. Would be a horrible way to go. Anyway, 2 of the 6 hit the Indianapolis, and she sank in 12 minutes. And if memory serves, part of that was because, A, they didn't know there were dangers in the area, and they were not told that the USS Underhill, a destroyer, had just been torpedoed a few days prior on the very same route they were taking. It was very hot. It was July in the Philippines, and they had their portholes and everything open. So when the water started pouring in, you can imagine how quickly that started to be a bad situation. The first torpedo actually hit a munitions hold, so it exploded. That obviously killed several sailors quickly. After she sank, the rest of the men were out floating in the water, and some of them actually, some of them jumped. Survivor Dick Thielen said, "I didn't leave the ship, she left me." He just basically slid off into the water. Some of them had life jackets. There were a couple of rafts. There were floater nets, but they were scattered all over, and nobody knew how many were left floating in the water. She actually sank a few minutes after midnight on July 30th, and they floated that night, and they were due in Leyte on Tuesday, so they thought, we're going to be rescued because they're going to miss us when we don't show up. Well, it had been decided that if a ship arrived at its destination, it would not be reported as missing, because they were trying to minimize the amount of communication, to try to keep quiet during, wartime. So somebody decided that, well, if they weren't to report ships who didn't arrive or did arrive, did they need to report ships that didn't arrive? And so they didn't, because they thought they weren't supposed to. So nobody reported that the Indy didn't arrive at her destination. So the men were covered in oil from the ship, and they didn't know who was who. They couldn't see who anybody was. It was dark. And all they knew was that those who survived the explosion but were injured needed protection. So if they had a floater net, or they had anything they could do to keep those men, protected, they had burns, they had broken bones, they had all kinds of, scrapes, bruises, all kinds of injuries. So they tried to protect those. Of course, the water was really cold at night, and the next day they wished for that cold a little bit, because then it got really hot. That oil protected their skin from the sunburn, but it was just so hot. And you can imagine the ocean water the glare from the sun and no way to protect yourself. Some people took off their socks or their shirts and put over their heads and try to protect themselves from it that way. So during the day they would get hot and they would be anxious for the night because they were the glare and the heat, and then in the day they were anxious for the night to cool off, and then it was cold. So and depending on what group they were in, that kind of determined when they saw sharks. Some never saw sharks. Some saw sharks very soon after. Ed Harrell, one of the Marines on board, there were 39 Marines on board, said that he could feel the currents of the shark swimming under his feet, and he would pull his feet up as close to his chest as he could to try to keep away from him. He was actually kind of dozing one night and looked over and saw his buddy's face in the water, and he tried to wake him up and then realized that his lower half was gone. He had been bitten off by a shark in the night. So days run together, no food, no water, dehydration sets in, hallucinations begin. Some of the men started drinking salt water. They would be, dead within a few hours of that. And some of the hallucinations, they would see water fountains under the water. They would see all kinds of different things, and they'd swim down to go get it and then never come back. It was very dangerous for a person to be outside the group because of the sharks, because if it was a single swimmer, they were much more likely to get pulled away by a shark. The guys on the floater nets were continuing to hold the injured inside, but they continued to pass. They just couldn't hold it together any longer. There were 1,195 men on the ship, and it was estimated that about 300 went down as a result of the explosions. And then they continued to pass on through. Father Thomas Conway, who was on board, was so busy. He went from person to person administering last rites and trying to offer comfort to the men, and died. I can't remember what day he actually passed, but it was from exhaustion, because he was so determined to give peace and comfort to all those who were going to die. And I think he's the one who actually also would take their dog tags off when they would pass. It kept them on his arm until there just got to be too many and they were too heavy, and he had to let them fall to the ocean floor. The life jackets, that the ones lucky enough to have life jackets were K-POC life jackets, and they were intended to last 72 hours. So as the days wore on and the life jackets began to get soaked, they would be up to their chin, so they're floating in the water with their heads barely out of the water, and the swells, coming over their faces, washing over their faces. So as the men would pass, they would take their life jackets and they would try to put them up somewhere so they could dry, and that way they would have a little more be able to float a little better. So they would rotate the life jackets as more life jackets became available. So on Thursday, they've been in the water for 4 nights, and on the 5th day, Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn was flying his PV-1 Ventura, and he was testing out a new trailing antenna on his airplane, and his crew was having trouble getting it to work, and so he turned over the controls to his co-pilot, and he went back to try to help them figure it out, and he spotted an oil slick, and he thought enemy submarine. So he flies down to get a closer look. He has the bomb bay doors open. He's ready to start attacking, and he sees heads floating in the water. And so he flies down, tips his wings, throws down whatever life-saving equipment they have on board, and radios in to say, we have ducks on the pond, we need help. And so other airplanes eventually show up, and they also bring life-saving supplies, whatever they had, their own life jackets even, because they could see the sharks picking these men off in the water, and they were mortified, and there's nothing they could do. And Some of the supplies didn't work. They broke. Like if they had wooden crates with water, the crates would break when they hit the water. Sometimes they landed too far away and the men were too weak to catch them, to swim over to them. And so then enter Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks, who was flying a Catalina PBY, which can land on the water. Marks was given strict orders not to do that, not to land on the water, but he did. He saw those men being picked off by the sharks, and he just couldn't help himself. So he lands the plane, and his crew, with his crew's approval, and they decide they're going to start trying to pull out the men who are single swimmers, because they could tell those were the most vulnerable. And so the first person they picked up was my friend James, who was said that he was given 3 ounces of orange juice and he passed out. They put him in the cabin and he passed out. And they started bringing in more and more men, and they realized that they were out of space and they were the only thing on the water. And so then they decided, well, let's put them on the wings, because the wings on a PBY are way up high. But there were still a lot of swells and high waves in the ocean, so they couldn't stay on the wings. They kept they weren't strong enough to hold themselves there, so they tied them down with parachute ropes on the wings, the ones that were able to at least get out there, and then the rest they put in the inside of the plane. All total, they rescued 56 men with a PBY. And then the USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived on scene, and they transferred the men on the plane to the ship. James didn't wake up until he heard them shooting the plane, because it was not able to fly again after it had landed such a hard landing, and they couldn't use it, so they had to sink it. And he woke up to the gunfire, thought they were being attacked again, was scared to death. And then other ships started to arrive, and other planes. And so when the Doyle arrived, Captain Claytor turned on his light, his beacon, and to let the guys in the water know that he was there and that they were going to be rescued. And Dick Thielen said that was such an amazing thing to see, to know that there was help. They aren't here yet, but they're coming for us, And there were a few who died trying to swim to rescue. They felt like they couldn't wait for the rescue to come to them, and they started swimming. They were just too weak, and they just went under the waves. All in all, they took 316 survived of the 1,195. And I think there were actually 318 placed on the ships, and if I remember correctly, 2 passed before they made it to the hospitals. They had to go to multiple hospitals because there were too many for one place. And so they were in the hospital for a very long time, and then they were taken to an R&R camp where they got all the ice cream they wanted. Every survivor story I've ever heard, they always mention the ice cream. And so they were there, and Admiral Spruance came and gave them their Purple Hearts. And it wasn't until they were there that they were told what they delivered, that they delivered the bomb that helped end the war. And but they were not allowed to talk about their story. It was not publicized at all until the war was over. And the headlines in the paper said the war is ended, and down below was a little teeny article, by the way, the USS Indianapolis sank. And so then comes the Navy deciding that we kind of need a scapegoat, because we just left these guys out there for 5 nights. They were out in the water, some of them over 100 hours, and with no food and no water. Roughly a third of the men died because they were left out there so long. And there's different schools of thoughts, I guess, but I'm of the opinion that, and many others are of the opinion that, the Navy decided that they needed to have a person to blame for this, and they chose the captain, Charles B. McVeigh III, and he was sent to trial for court-martial for 2 causes: one, failure to zigzag, and one, failure to abandon, to give the order to abandon ship. the latter of which he was not found guilty of, because it was determined that the communications on the ship were out and that he could not give that as an official order, but it was verbally told and passed down to the crew. And so he was found guilty. Interesting side note, Commander Hashimoto was brought from Japan to testify against McVeigh. He thought he was being brought to the U.S. to be killed, but he came anyway. And he told them, I fired 6 torpedoes. It did not matter whether he zigzagged or not, at least one would have hit him. And that was later proven to be true many years later. But no matter which direction the ship had been in, he had him. There was no escape. And so, but McVeigh was found guilty. He was court-martialed. He did not leave the Navy, but his career was basically over. His father was an admiral, and so this was a very devastating blow to him. Not to mention the tremendous responsibility he felt for his crew and all those who had passed. He never really recovered from it. The men got together in 1960 to have a reunion. They realized that they really needed to talk about it. Some of them anyway, they needed to talk about it. They needed time together. And so they started a reunion, and my friend Dick was very instrumental in that. And they invited Captain McVeigh, and he did not think that he was going to be well received, but like Hashimoto, he went anyway. And the men were very supportive of him, and he learned that they really did not blame him at all, and were very happy to see him, and he had a really great reunion with them. So they decided they would meet every 5 years after that. He did not attend the 65 reunion, I don't believe. But in 1968, the guilt, he couldn't take it anymore. He would receive Christmas cards from lost at sea families saying things like, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. Mine is not, because you killed my son. And he went out on the porch of his home in Connecticut with a toy soldier that his father, or toy sailor that his father had given him when he was a child, and went out on the front steps and killed himself with a gun. And his housekeeper heard the shots. His crew never gave up trying to exonerate him. And matter of fact, their motto was never give up, for survival and for Captain McVeigh. And so fast forward several years, and despite all the efforts of the crew to try to exonerate him, they were not successful. But fast forward to more recent years, and 12-year-old Hunter Scott was watching Jaws with his father and saw the excerpt that Quint gives talking about the Indy, and he asked his father about it, and his dad was a principal, and he said, or a teacher, I'm not sure which, let's go to the library and we'll research it. So he looked it up, and he was very interested in the story. He decided to do a history project on it, and he was very successful in raising awareness, and he wrote letters to survivors, and some of them wrote him back, and he actually received a great deal of information that helped him decide that Captain McVeigh was not guilty, and he was going to do whatever he could to prove that. And a congressman offered to put his display for this history project in his office, and that garnered a lot more publicity as well. And if you Google it, you'll see interviews of him with David Letterman on the Today Show. He made all the circuits. Anyway, he ended up, with the help of Captain Bill Tody, who was the commander of the USS Indianapolis SSN 697 submarine, and several of the survivors and others, they were successful in getting the captain exonerated. I think it was officially made public in 2000, the year 2000. And so Hunter is now actually in the Navy as well. And Dick said, I really we tried for so many years to clear our captain's good name, and it took a 12-year-old boy to make it happen. But it happened, and that was all that really mattered to all of them. So the survivors continue to hold their reunions. They had reunions every year and still continue to do so. There's 2 survivors still living. One is 95 and one is 98. And they enjoy being able to share the story and keep the story going, because they have not lived a day of their life when they haven't thought of this story and their friends that went down with the ship. And James said, I spent 19 months on that ship, and in a few minutes I saw all my friends and my life go down with it. And one person said, if I ever forget it for one day, I remember it 2 days the next, or 2 times the next day. And so I just think it's important to share the story and let others know the sacrifice, and those who lived sacrificed as well, because it changed their lives forever. The work that they did, whether you believe in the bombings or not, it did end the war. And there are plenty of experts who say that had we invaded Japan, there would have been millions of lives lost, many more than were lost in the bombings. So take that for however you want to take it. If anyone is interested in books or other things that you can learn more about it, a few things I would recommend are, it's on Amazon Prime and iTunes, and I guess pretty much every streaming service, is a documentary called USS Indianapolis, The Legacy, directed by Sarah Vladeck, and she interviewed hundreds of survivors over many, many years. And it's strictly them telling the story along with a few family members that represent those who have passed, whether it be survivors or that have passed or lost at sea family. It's a wonderful documentary that tells the story through their eyes. There's also a book that Sarah and Lynn Vincent did called Indianapolis. That is the most recent book. It actually also covers the ship, when the ship was found a few years ago. It actually it's recent enough to cover that. This is the book that started it for me, Doug Stanton's In Harm's Way. Oops, wrong direction. If you saw the movie Horse Soldiers with Chris Hemsworth, Doug also wrote that book. Very, very good book. And this one, Only 317 Survived, was actually the brainchild of Mary Lou Murphy, who was the wife of Paul Murphy. And this book is stories by the survivors themselves. Each survivor has a chapter in here, and it's the story as they saw it. And it is now available on Kindle, but it's only 316 survived, because at the time that this book was created, they thought it was 317, and it wasn't until Lynn and Sarah did their book they found out it was 316. So it's available on Kindle. Anyway, there's many, many books out there, but those are the ones that I've found to be the most interesting, although I still have several left to read. Anyway, I think that's all I have.
Well, it was very good and informative, and you hit the high parts and covered the whole thing. I didn't know if you were going to cover the whole thing.
Yeah,
but you just really went ahead and dove right in and did all the way up through the little man saves the captain's name, and
yes,
he gets exonerated.
You could spend probably an hour on each section. You could spend an hour on the ship's history, and another hour on the court-martial, another hour on the time in the water, and another hour on the rescue. It's a very, very long and detailed story, but that's the high notes, I think. And not a polished version. I've never told this story in that length before, so I hope I didn't make any factual errors.
Well, the comments are, it was masterful, and they're going to do more research, and that you did great, and it was very interesting. What I was wondering is, you said the bomb was assembled on the plane.
I believe that's correct. Yes,
Okay,
I believe
so
that's correct.
they just carried pieces and the uranium, or right,
Yes,
and they delivered it to the island, not
yes.
knowing what it was.
Right. It was not together. The
Right, it was
parts,
just
yeah.
yeah, and then they set sail to come back to the United States.
Well, no, they were going to they went to Guam. I can't remember what they did in Guam, and then they were going to Leyte, I think for target practice with, I want to say the USS Idaho, I think.
So the
Was
war is still raging,
going. Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, still going.
And so, when was the bomb assembled and dropped in relationship to the story? You said the war was over. They did a newspaper article, but when did they drop off and then 2 weeks later the bomb is dropped, or was they
Well,
dropped off the
Japan,
parts and it was 2 days later?
I think it was actually, I'll have to actually Google that because I'm not sure. I think the bomb was actually dropped in on August 6th, I want to say, but the Japanese did not. And then the one in Nagasaki was dropped a few days later. I think Japan was, if I remember correctly, Japan was actually already in the process of surrendering when Nagasaki was hit. They hadn't officially said it yet, and so Nagasaki was hit, and then the official papers were signed, I believe, on the USS Missouri on August 15th, 1945. So, but I want to say that the first bomb was dropped on August 6th, but I'm not 100% sure about
And that's
that.
the one that they carried the parts for, the little man or little
Yeah,
boy.
little
Or
boy, little boy.
okay.
Yes.
So does anybody in the watching have a question or thought? Anything that you can think of? I know it's a lot in 30 minutes, and
It was, sorry, it was August 6th was the date it was dropped.
okay. So, but I guess the point of having Jennifer on was to get the story overall. I know there's a lot of details that she's left out. She actually, how many of the survivors have you got to meet?
I've met 6, I think, plus a couple on Zoom. I started a Zoom meeting a few years ago after I met James, and I wasn't able to visit anymore, and started a Zoom group to allow the survivors and friends and family to communicate. And so met a couple that way. Met a few at the reunion in Indianapolis in 2019. Oh, and also a couple little tidbits of extra story. The flag that was flying, I may be wrong about this. It was either flying when the ship was hit by the kamikaze, or it was flying when the 9 who were killed were buried at sea. Again, I would have to double check to see which was correct. But it was flying when those 9 on the ship, when those 9 were still living. It was given to the family of 19-year-old Earl Prosai, who was one of the buglers on the ship. He was from Minnesota, and that flag was given to his family. There was a monument created in 1995 in the city of Indianapolis for the ship. It's a beautiful, beautiful monument. You can Google it, Indianapolis monument on Canal Walk, and it's gorgeous. And it was dedicated in 1995, and this year, for the 77th anniversary of the sinking, that flag was flown over the monument, which was pretty amazing. Also, a funnier side note, when they canceled leaves, July 15th, they announced all leaves were canceled. James had a girlfriend named Louise, and he just couldn't help himself. He had to go see Louise one last time before he went off to battle. And so he snuck off the ship that night, and when he got back, they were waiting on him. Turns out that was the 4th time James had gone AWOL, but the only time he was ever caught. And punishment for that was 5 nights of bread and water in the brig, and a $100 fine, which $100 in 1945 was a few months' pay for him. He told me he started out, he made like 20 something dollars a month when he started out, and he had been on the ship a year or so at that point, year and a half. Anyway, he didn't serve his sentence immediately. He actually, they made it to Pearl Harbor, left Pearl Harbor, and were on their way to Tinian before he had to start serving his sentence. So he was released from the brig the afternoon of the sinking, roughly 12 hours before the ship sank. And so he had bread and water for 5 days prior. He had one meal on July 29th, and then he had 5 more nights or days of no food. He said he lost over 40 pounds. And his cell was so small, he said he was basically in the fetal position in order to sleep. There wasn't enough room to stretch out his legs. And I asked him, the obvious question, was it worth it? And with the biggest grin and the biggest twinkle he could possibly have in his 94-year-old eyes, he said, absolutely. But he couldn't help it. He had to go.
Well, he'd never been caught before, so
right, he did.
Right,
his record was pretty good that he wasn't.
I wonder, did he ever say whether all those times were with Louise, or were they? Did he ever allude to that?
He did not say.
You didn't think to ask him, did you?
They kept in touch. Even after the war was over, they kept in touch. And I think they wrote letters for a while. And then she moved, and he lost track of her. He didn't know where she was. I tried to find her, but he couldn't remember how to spell her last name, and I couldn't find out. He goes, well, she's probably dead anyway. And I said, well, you're not dead, so she might not be either. But I couldn't find her. I just didn't have enough information, and he couldn't remember. So...
All right, well, this wasn't my typical, if you could say typical show, but I hope people found it interesting. It was a deviation from what, like I said, what I try to do, but I think it's interesting. There's a lot more to it. She could probably tell us a lot more about it. But, time constraints. And if you think you'd like to hear more, or I think she's quite not an expert maybe, but she likes the Titanic story a lot. So she could probably go over that for a couple of hours at least at some point. But
I don't know. The Indianapolis pushed a lot of the Titanic out of my brain. Yeah. But probably so. I watched Sarah's documentary, the Legacy documentary, and I saw all those guys had a similar theme, that they wanted the story to be told. They wanted the story to continue long after they were gone. And I made a promise to them in my mind that day that I watched that I was going to do that I was going to do anything I could. And I promised James and Dick personally, sitting on their couches, and told them both that too. And so that's why I do what I do. And that's why the Indianapolis has taken over where the Titanic used to be. But they just don't want people to forget.
Leave it in the comments or email me, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that's at Minutes with Mylo. And if you want more like this, or, I know 2 things, Titanic and the Indianapolis. So if you want more of that, then Jennifer's your girl. We can talk about that. But if nobody has any questions, we can call it a night. It's 45 minutes into it, and I say this every time. It's a little past what I normally wanted to go, but I'm finding out that what I want just doesn't happen. It just goes on and on. But, a lot of times it's worth it, so that's fine. If people are interested in watching it, we could go on and on. But maybe she can read one of those books on our lunch break. Probably not. That would be worse than trying to get through a day of the Civil War at lunch break. So, but anyway, I appreciate everybody coming, and Jennifer for volunteering to be on here. and we'll do it again. Maybe dive into a certain aspect of it a little more in depth, because like I said, she's kind of glossed over it. And I think it's really interesting that I think the Navy kind of forgot, and that's why when the young boy came up and said, hey, I'm really interested in this, I think it's wrong what happened, and he brought to light the people that were trying to keep it hush hush were probably retired or dead or both. But anyway, I think that's when they finally came out and said, hey, you know what, this probably needs to be rectified, and she could tell you a lot more on why it should be it did get rectified and why it should have been rectified in a different time. But
one other little note, I mentioned the mementos that Hunter Scott received. He actually has Captain McVeigh's dog tags. That's kind of huge in my mind.
All right, so Thursday night I'm going to do another one. So I don't think I have a guest. Anybody wants to belly up to the bar and say that they'll join me, that'd be great. But if not, then you get what I come up with, and you might leave after a couple of minutes. But anyway, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks, Jennifer.
Yep, anytime.
All right, Marie says, good job, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you, Marie.
She made it, even though she was just like lurking in the shadows. So
better late than never.
All right, see y'all.
See ya.
Bye.